As we noted in our flyer, this program on the 20th of October looks ahead, in a sense, to the 24th of October, which is the anniversary of the beginning of the Charter of the United Nations, October 24th, 1945. And we're reminded, of course, that that particular organization was founded for the purposes of trying to more effectively resolve conflict, to deal with the underlying causes of conflict, and to do so by bringing all the nations of the world together in a kind of legislature, and in so doing have a center of global diplomacy, all the while recognizing the realism of the importance of the great powers in the way in which the Security Council was formulated and the veto powers granted. So we join with the United Nations associations of the United States, the nation in general, in recognizing that noble enterprise, which is the same enterprise that all serious people interested in international affairs are engaged in, trying to help construct a more stable world order and to cope with what are the inevitable, it seems, problems of the world, one of which we'll certainly be dealing with tonight. Mr. Kaiser's remarks are entitled Addressing the Challenges of North Korea's Nuclear Program. And most of the problems which we are in the headlines today, whether they be of terrorism or non-proliferation or regional stability, seem to all reach a kind of a nexus in the North Korean problem. As I say, we're absolutely delighted to have Mr. Kaiser with us. He's a seasoned veteran of the State Department. He's also a native of Towson, Maryland, graduate of Towson High, University of Maryland, class of 1965, majoring in political science and Russian studies, master's degree from the George Washington University and its School of Sino-Soviet Studies. He studied Chinese at the National Taiwan University and then was in the PhD program at George Washington Sino-Soviet Institute, this time emphasizing Chinese studies, having emphasized Russian and Eastern European studies in his master's work. He joined the State Department in 1971. He's spent much of his career focusing upon East Asia. He's had 3 assignments in Beijing, 3 to the Chinese-Mongolian desk at State, was the director of that bureau at one time, and has been assigned twice to Tokyo. As a senior State Department officer, he's been a senior member of the Inspector General's staff. He's also served with the rank of ambassador, a Senate confirmation, as a special negotiator on the resolving of regional conflicts in the new independent states. He's also been the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research. And for the last several years, he has been first the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Asian and Pacific Affairs, and at the present time, since January of this year, the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for Asian and Pacific Affairs. The topic is most interesting. Mr. Kaiser is a veteran in this particular area, and he is paying special attention to North Korea at this time. It's my enormous pleasure to present to you Mr. Donald L. Kaiser.
If you look out at the world today, particularly in the wake of I think we can agree at least that we are working toward a success in Iraq. If you look at that situation and you look around the world, probably the only remaining situation we face today that could erupt into a major conflict, and not only a major conflict, but a conflict with nuclear weapons, is the situation on the Korean Peninsula. In a sense, this crept up on us Who would have thought that a nation like North Korea, which can barely feed its people, that is the last remaining Stalinist state on the face of the earth, that has a leader who, for a long while, we all thought was somewhere between demented and certifiably insane, so much so that when, I think 2 years ago, The Economist magazine ran Kim Jong-il's picture on their cover following a meeting in Pyongyang, they ran it under the heading, "Hello, Earthlings." That was the kind of impression we had of Kim Jong-il. He was very much a man from another planet. He was a man who really was from another time. He marched to his own drummer, and the drumbeat that he marched to, I think, in fairness, you would have to say is a murderous drumbeat. This is a guy who does preside over one of the most evil, to use the word that the president used, one of the most evil despotic regimes on the face of the earth. People do perish in large numbers. They perish because of the misbegotten policies that Kim Jong-il has presided over. Some 2 million North Koreans estimated died of famine a couple of years ago. Many others have perished in prison cells and labor camps in North Korea. Today, again, by way of introduction, you have in northeast China, across the border from North Korea, anywhere between 50,000 and 250,000 North Koreans who went over into China, frankly, to cultivate the soil, to work in factories, to feed themselves, to send money back to their family. Kim Jong-il and his regime have tolerated this because it is a safety valve. It is about the only thing that keeps his state afloat, the ability to bring in foreign assistance and the ability to send his citizens across the border into China to make money and to get food. So that's the kind of regime we're talking about in very general terms. What has happened, though, is this. Kim Jong-il has also presided over a regime like many in the communist world, and I think it was true of many in the former Soviet Union and Warsaw Pact, that did place a premium on science and technology education. This state, the Stalinist state, managed to identify, cultivate, nurture, train, reward a privileged elite, and some of them are good. These are world-class scientists. Furthermore, the North Korean scientists were able over the years to get assistance from their comrades in the former Soviet Union. They got assistance from other countries around the world, so that by the late 1980s, it became clear that the North Koreans were in fact embarked on a serious nuclear weapons development program. This came, as I said, as a profound shock to the United States, to the US intelligence community. I was serving in Beijing at the time as head of what we call the political section there, and we brought our first team of briefers to China. The briefers came from the Central Intelligence Agency. The point was to try to interest the Chinese in what we saw as a looming threat to our national security and also potentially to the national security of China and to other nations in Northeast Asia. So our guys, our briefers came to China to give highly classified briefings, complete with overhead photography, with nice early PowerPoint presentations, showing quite plainly that the North Koreans had established in a place called Yongbyon a world-class center for nuclear reprocessing. It was a facility or a set of installations that was plainly designed to give North Korea, in due course, a capability to handle an entire nuclear fuel cycle, so that without any reference to other nations of the world or other suppliers, North Korea would, in due course, be able to construct its own atomic weapon. At the same time, North Korea was also pursuing a missile program, which plainly was a missile program designed at some point to be married with that nuclear weapons capability. So along about 1990-91, we briefed the Chinese on this, showed them the slides, gave them our analytical finding, and the Chinese sat there at the table and smiled and said, "Thank you very much for coming all this way. They're nice photographs. Photographs lie, you know. We can doctor photographs too. We've done it in our past. We don't do that anymore. But frankly, our intelligence, our assessment is different than yours. We don't believe the North Koreans are doing that. We don't think they're capable of doing that." Fast forward a few more years to 1993, and it had become apparent that North Korea was indeed embarked and rather well advanced on a serious nuclear weapons development program. We became extremely concerned at the time, began to raise this issue with the North Koreans indirectly. We began to raise it with our allies, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and we began to lobby fairly hard with the Chinese and the then post-Soviet Russians, attempting to get them to use the influence they had to place checks and constraints on the North Koreans so that they would see what all of us thought we saw, namely that this is a non-starter, it is a self-defeating policy. Nuclear weapons are not going to give security to a nation like North Korea. To the contrary, they are going to increase the insecurity of this kind of a nation. At least this was our perception. So in 1993, 1994, we spent almost a full year locked in extremely tough negotiations with the North Koreans over what to do with this set of facilities, these installations, these nascent capabilities to construct a nuclear weapon. By that time, by the way, our intelligence had already concluded tentatively that the North Koreans had on their own produced enough fissile material so that they could at least hypothetically construct 1 to 2 atomic bombs. Again, 1993, 1994. So we saw a certain imperative in negotiating a resolution of this situation with the North Koreans. The good news is that the North Koreans, as I say, are in a state which has, frankly, nothing going for it. They cannot grow enough food to feed the people. They have no industry worthy of the name. They have no export products worthy of the name. And so for them, even Kim Jong-il recognized that there was going to be a need to deal with that economic situation. In due course, what we found then in the course of these negotiations with the North Koreans was that we began to reach the outline or the shape of a tacit agreement. If the North Koreans gave up all of their capabilities in this area, if they signed on again to the Non-Proliferation Treaty from which they'd temporarily withdrawn, if they opened up their nuclear facilities to inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, for our part, the United States, which was the only negotiating partner at the time, agreed that we would do a number of things. First, we would undertake to get something like $500 million worth of heavy fuel oil. The North Koreans had consistently said that, no, you misunderstand these nuclear facilities. It's not to build a bomb at all. What it's really to do is provide us energy for electricity. Our country has no electricity. We haven't harnessed the water power that does exist, so we need to go the nuclear route, and that's all there is to it. Again, our intelligence made plain that that was not, in fact, their real intent. But it seemed that the North Koreans were indeed capable of understanding that if they had this bargaining chip on the table of their nascent nuclear capability, they would be able to extract from the rest of the world various and sundry inducements. So what we said was, number one, we would provide heavy fuel oil to provide for heating and for electricity. Number two, the United States would join with some of its partners in a consortium which came to be called the Korean Energy Development Organization, or KATO, to provide funding, to provide technological expertise, and to provide actually the contractors to build 2 light water reactors. The light water reactors could, in fact, be monitored very closely. We decided that there was not going to be the same concern about diversion of the product of that reprocessed fuel into nuclear capabilities. So we began in good faith to build those light water reactors together with our partners, the Japanese, the South Koreans, and the European Union. That was the state of play pretty much through the 1990s. Toward the very end of the Clinton administration in the year 2000, we had again begun to receive some rather distressing intelligence reports that the North Koreans were very possibly abiding by their agreement on the agreed framework not to proceed at Yongbyon with reprocessing of fuel. They couldn't, after all, because they were under strict inspection by the International Atomic Energy Agency. But they seemed, in fact, to be developing a capability somewhere else in North Korea. For those of you who don't know the nation, it's a nation that is literally pockmarked with caves with tunnels, with hidden valleys. Very tough place for even the most sophisticated satellite imagery to detect something going on. And trust me, we had many extremely seasoned, talented analysts looking night and day at what the North Koreans might be doing. From time to time, we began to get indications that there was some construction going on that very possibly was linked to another nuclear program, but we weren't certain. We had just begun to worry that that's what in fact was going on. There was a raging analytical debate in any case as to whether the North Koreans ever had meant to abide by their agreement in 1993-94. The argument goes that a nation which after all has not much going for it and who ultimately fears attack by its neighbors and by the United States believes that its only possible deterrent is to have a nuclear weapon. What does that mean? Nuclear blackmail, in a word. In short, because the North Koreans had been concerned that the United States and its allies would seek in some fashion to promote regime change in that country. What they were saying in essence is, if you mess with us, maybe we'll lob a nuclear weapon somewhere that hurts. Japan, in Tokyo, Seoul, Korea, your bases in those countries. From time to time, the North Koreans, who are much given to rather bloody-minded rhetoric, would say that they had the capability already to turn Seoul into a sea of fire, or they would say, we can engulf Tokyo in flames. And oh, by the way, American troops stationed in those countries would not be spared either. 100,000 Americans would perish if we dreamed of doing anything to their nation. So we're dealing with a country that, in some senses, feels it has nothing to lose. It has its back up against a wall. It's looking for whatever leverage, whatever advantage it can get. And in this spirit of isolationist, juche, as they call it, or self-sufficiency, the North Koreans seemed quite prepared to play this thing out and indeed go to the brink of war. So by the year 2000, as we began to see further indications that the North Koreans were pursuing a new kind of nuclear capability, we sent a mission there in the waning months, I believe in October of 2000, then Secretary of State Albright led a delegation to Pyongyang. She was the first American to actually meet with Kim Jong-il, a bizarre encounter in many ways. I think the historians will have to record this, but Albright found herself in a stadium believing that the reception was for her. Actually, it wasn't. It was a major national holiday that the North Koreans were promoting. So she felt that Kim Jong-il had brought 100,000 citizens with pom-poms and bands out to welcome her. And hard to say whether she was pleased or just puzzled by the whole thing, but it made for some bad headlines at the time. Secretary Albright goes to the den of evil, smiles and clinks glasses with the despot of North Korea, was the tone of it. When Secretary Albright actually met with Kim Jong-il, she found that the guy was quite rational within his own framework. His office had modern computers in it. He showed with pride that he knew how to access the internet. He showed that he had access to CNN and indeed all of the world's media and knew perfectly well what was going on in the rest of the world. And he essentially offered a kind of a strange deal on the spot. He said, once and for all, we're willing to give up our nuclear capabilities if you, for your part, are willing to support us in economic development, if you're willing to normalize diplomatic relations, and we're also willing, he said, to cease doing anything in the missile field, testing, exporting components of them, if you, in return, will launch satellites for us, which we found to be a particularly strange kind of request. In the end, Secretary Albright was puzzled by that. I think, again, you have to recall 1 month before the election in 2000, there was considerable interest. Would it be possible to reach a deal with Kim Jong-il? If so, that would be a rather startling diplomatic achievement. Some believed it would be not unlike Nixon's trip to China, opening up China to the rest of the world. In the end, I think, if I can editorialize, cooler heads prevailed. And when the party got back to Washington, I was at that time in intelligence and research, people asked some fairly tough questions, some fairly pointed questions, like, well, did he really agree to everything you asked, and the answer was yeah, he agreed to everything without exception. The next question was, did he understand what he was being asked? The answer to that was probably not, no. The next question is, well, if he's the supreme leader, can he make that stick? Can he agree to something that is extremely weird and mindless, but because he is the dictatorial guy he is, can he make that stick? Unfortunately, we were not able in good conscience to agree that he could make that stick, because although he is a Stalinist kind of leader, the fact is that he is dependent upon a regime elite of his military, of his intelligence and secret police forces, and indeed of the educated technocrats in North Korea. So our judgment was that probably Kim Jong-il himself could not sustain that kind of a deal. We opted instead to send experts back to try to probe at the expert level what would be possible, and in the end the whole deal came apart because the experts made plain they did understand what we were asking, and there was no way they were going to go along with it. So we simmered along. The new administration, the Bush administration, came in, and some of you may recall that at the very outset of the administration, President Bush said that he was skeptical about the way North Korea policy had been handled by the Clinton administration. He therefore had instructed the administration to do a quick survey of what had gone on and to make its recommendations to him. That was not an easy task. Frankly speaking, it consumed us for 8 or 9 months. And the reason it consumed us for 8 or 9 months is because there are fundamental divisions in our government, in the country, over the key question of whether it is indeed possible to deal with a leader like Kim Jong-il. If you strike a deal with him, is it really possible to imagine that he is going to adhere to his end of the bargain? If he adheres to his end of the bargain, or seems to, does the United States, for its part, have the technical means, what we call the national technical means and capabilities, which is another way of saying intelligence assets, to be able to verify that North Korea is in fact keeping its end of the bargain? These questions became very relevant because the intelligence reports began to come in with increased frequency, suggesting that not only was Kim Jong-il embarked on another nuclear weapons program, but it was a nuclear weapons program based on a completely different technology. The Yongbyon technology had been based on a plutonium bomb somewhere in a place unknown. Kim Jong-il was apparently embarked on a different nuclear weapons program that would rely upon highly enriched uranium. So what he was trying to do was, I think, undetected, increase his ability to have his cake and eat it too. In a word, he desperately needed the economic benefits he was receiving from the U.S. and partners of the U.S., but at the same time, he plainly wanted to have that trump card or that bargaining chip or that blackmail weapons system. My boss, Jim Kelly, led a delegation to Pyongyang in October of 2002. Contrary to the press version of events, contrary to some of the mythology that has perhaps grown up around this administration's policy, Jim Kelly, my boss, went there really intending to raise in a low-key fashion with the North Koreans what we thought might be going on, to invite them to cease and desist doing that, and having done that, to embark on a wholly new approach with us. Jim went there with what we called a bold vision or a bold architecture, in which we were prepared to tell the North Koreans precisely how we, working together with Japan, South Korea, and others, would attempt to bring North Korea back into the community of nations, sponsor productive economic relationships, and perhaps economic reform within North Korea. Make available to North Korea the kind of scientific, technological expertise that it needed to modernize its country and indeed join the modern world. Let me pause here briefly and say that one more aspect of North Korea I should highlight. Because North Korea does have a moribund economy and an economy without hope, it has based its economy on really what you would have to call, for lack of a better term, a criminal state. North Korea, I think perhaps uniquely among nations of the world, has been active in counterfeiting U.S. $100 notes. and getting those US $100 notes out into the world's banks and the world's stock markets and so forth and so on. North Korea has, over the years, participated in narcotics smuggling from one nation to another. North Korea has been involved in trafficking in endangered species, rhinoceros or elephant tusk ivory, for example. North Korea has been involved in working to smuggle people, trafficking in persons. It is in every sense a state that, if not quite a criminal state, I might exaggerate slightly, it is a state that has relied upon profits from criminal enterprises to help sustain its economy and to keep its elite in power. So we had that to deal with as well. How do you persuade Kim Jong-il that this is not acceptable, it is unsustainable, and it will be combated by the United States and by its partners? So at the same time, we were attempting to engage the North Koreans in a dialogue over the nature, the shape, the content of the future. We were also making plain that we would begin to look quite seriously at what we had begun to see was a pattern of activity. It was not rogue operations that as we had thought in the 1990s of diplomats trying to fund their operations, or rogue intelligence officers or military officers trying to fund a particular purchase or something like that. We have found through an analysis of all of the materials available that the North Koreans really have centralized this kind of operation at the very top of their leadership structure. They're earning probably $1 billion to $2 billion a year in hard currency from this kind of activity. That we are operating on a separate track. Through our law enforcement officers, through our intelligence officers, we're strengthening our ties with sister services around the world with an eye toward exposing what the North Koreans are doing, making this known to intelligence, law enforcement organizations throughout Asia and indeed throughout the world, and thus sending a signal to the North Koreans, no more nice guy, we're not going to look the other way, we're not going to accept this as part of the price of doing business, and that come what may, we are going to be choking off this kind of profit. So it was a fairly tough message that we've delivered to North Korea. It's a message that I think we all think they needed to hear. And again, there was this vision of a brighter future, because in the end, no nation really wants, I think, to sustain its regime, to sustain its people on the edifice of narcotics smuggling, trafficking in people, and so forth and so on. Nor does it want to see 50,000 to 250,000 of its citizens crossing the border into China to find the good life. And here too, I pause in irony, because when I first went to China in the 1970s, China was much like North Korea is today. So for any communist state looking at China, you have a vision of what is possible with enough determination to transform the nature of the system, with determination to promote broad education of the people, with determination and willingness to work with the rest of the world. You can indeed work miracles, and China has done that over the span of 20 years. So for people from North Korea now to go over into China is, in a sense, the ultimate insult to Kim Jong-il and to his philosophy of Juche, or self-sufficiency. Where are we now? We have been attempting to do something a little bit different in the past year with the North Koreans. We thought, in retrospect, through this policy review that was conducted at the beginning of the administration, that we had committed one blunder in posturing ourselves as the single negotiating partner of North Korea. That is, the agreed framework negotiations were handled entirely by the US on one side of the table, North Korea on the other. In the end, we got a deal. The deal worked, in a sense, for 10 years because it did put a lid on North Korea's ability to reprocess spent fuel and acquire fissile material. At the same time, though, we found, to our chagrin, that we wound up the only guarantors of the agreement. North Korea, in a sense, had cast us as the only ones on earth who had negotiated this agreement, and therefore the only ones who would be aggrieved if in some way this was broken. We found in retrospect that we had perhaps not included even our allies enough in our thinking, in our deliberations, in our negotiating strategy on this. And in light of the North Korean decision to break their agreement of 1993-94, we were determined that we would not repeat that set of mistakes and again get drawn into a bilateral direct set of talks with the North Koreans. What we said instead was that we look at this as an opportunity for each nation that is directly concerned with North Korea's capabilities, its intents, and its infrastructure to have a seat at the table, to articulate not only its concerns, but also to express on behalf of its own nation what that nation looked to North Korea to do, and also what that nation could do to assist North Korea if you took the brighter picture of how this could all come out. North Koreans resisted for months. They did not want to get embroiled in a multilateral set of talks, even less, and this has to do with the reason we're here, the UN Day, even less did they want this to get thrown into the United Nations, because the North Koreans, having withdrawn yet again from the Non-Proliferation Treaty, having kicked out yet again the International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors, had in a sense thumbed its nose at the United Nations, at the entire international community, and was quite well aware, these are no fools, they're crazy, but they're no fools. They concluded that any multilateral talks, any talks that involved the United Nations, would have the effect of putting North Korea against the rest of the international community. So they dragged their feet. They presented many reasons why they could only talk with the U.S. Again, ironic, because they had consistently said that they feared the U.S., believed that we were preparing to attack them or invade them or launch a preemptive strike against them. And yet at the same time, out of the other side of their mouths, they kept saying, in the end, we only trust the United States to make good on the deal, and if the United States will sign a simple non-aggression treaty with us, that will suffice. We'll then believe you. A position we find bizarre, to put it mildly. President Bush, from the outset, has said three things. He said them clearly, he said them repeatedly. We will not invade North Korea, we have no intent to do so. We will not attack North Korea, we have no intent to do so. We have no intent to promote regime change in North Korea. So we've tried to convince the North Koreans that if the President of the United States, who is after all the highest elected official in our land and who has the authority derived from that, gives that kind of security commitment to North Korea, they need to believe it. What on earth would be achieved by signing a piece of paper, we said. We're baffled. The history of non-aggression pacts in the world is not a particular happy one. As we all know, when Hitler and Stalin signed one, it did not stop Hitler from invading the Soviet Union, and we've pointed that out to the North Koreans too, saying, if you don't trust us, why would a non-aggression treaty persuade you to trust us more? What would stop us if we wished from simply ripping up that piece of paper? So far, no good answer to all of that. In the end, the Chinese, who have seen the North Korean situation as a direct threat to their own security interests, began for the first time since their emergence as a regional power and a growing presence on the international stage as the broker of multilateral talks. While the Chinese have spent the last 20 years denying they have any leverage, any special access, any particular knowledge of what goes on in North Korea, the fact of the matter is that the Chinese, as desperately as we, do not want North Korea to have nuclear weapons. First, they don't want North Korea to have nuclear weapons because of the imitation effect, if you like. The Chinese have long feared, as frankly have we, that if North Korea achieved a nuclear capability with a delivery capability, other nations in the region are going to be sorely tempted to try to do the same. Japan races to mind as one nation, which has long had the capability to build nuclear weapons in a flash if it meant to do so. No question about their competence and their technological expertise. South Korea probably could do the same. Even Taiwan in the region, as early as the 1970s, was pursuing a nuclear weapons capability, but was persuaded not to do that because it would not, in fact, enhance Taiwan's security. From the PRC perspective, if North Korea acquired those nuclear weapons, it would set in motion a chain reaction that would threaten China's role in this emerging new constellation of forces of powers in East Asia. The other part that we talk about less is also quite plain. The Chinese understand fully that the U.S. is not in a position to accept a North Korea with nuclear weapons. So as the Chinese reason it through, if the North Koreans seem bound and determined to have that, who can predict what the United States might do? There could yet be war. China does not want to have a war on its borders, even less does it want the United States to use all of its military might to take out North Korea's nuclear capabilities, its military capabilities. For China, the result of that would be quite plain. The peninsula would be unified under South Korea, under occupation, at least for a time, of U.S. military forces. The U.S. base structure military forces would be that much closer to China. This would disrupt trade in the region for China, and China now has a booming trade with South Korea. In short, too unpredictable, beyond which the other consequence that anyone could see would be a rapid flow of refugees over into China. And though China is now a modernizing nation, it is not yet a rich nation outside of the cities along the eastern and southern seaboard. China really cannot support an influx of 200,000 or 1 million refugees coming in as a result of a war into northeast China. So they want to avoid that too. As a result, I think, of such a calculus, the Chinese, for the first time, acknowledge, well, maybe they did, after all, have a little bit of influence with North Korea. So they sent a delegation to North Korea, the upshot of which is that the North Koreans saw the light. The North Koreans agreed in April to come to a meeting in Beijing with China and the U.S. We did that. We made plain at the time we would not continue these talks without our two partners, Japan and the Republic of Korea there. And if Russia wanted to be there, Russia should also be there, because all of these nations had security interests and economic interests in the region. Again, the North Koreans balked at that, seeing that the likely outcome was 5 against 1 at the table. We persevered. We insisted that this was the best mechanism. The Chinese ultimately agreed. The Chinese again went to the North Koreans, again persuaded them that it was in their interest, whatever that means, for them to come to the table. I think we have a hint of what it means in that the Chinese, who are, I think, subtle practitioners of the diplomatic black arts, saw fit to turn off the oil pipeline for a while to North Korea as a reminder of the fact that the Chinese do in fact have considerable leverage with them. So North Korea is not in the end going to be a free actor. Right now, we are in the process of these 6-party talks. We think the forum is one that holds promise. We think it's been extremely useful for the other nations at the table, the other 4, that is, to hear directly from North Korea its concerns and, very frankly, its threats. The North Koreans had played a little game that had become tiring, in which they would reserve their bloodiest threats for us, and then when they met others, whether Americans from the outside or other foreigners, they would tone down the rhetoric, and they would then claim that, well, the Americans don't understand Korean, their language skills aren't very good, they probably misunderstood us, and we never said any such thing. So we found it extremely useful for the Chinese, the Russians, the South Koreans, and the Japanese to hear firsthand the kind of threats the North Koreans are prone to make. They have, for example, threatened to continue with reprocessing of spent fuel, produce fissile material, and then sell or transfer that fissile material wherever they wish. I can tell you all, and I'm sure Cofer Black will wax eloquent on this, in the wake of September 11th, if there is a single threat that gets our attention, it's that one, the notion that any state would contemplate selling nuclear material or a nuclear weapon to a rogue state or to a terrorist group is something that I would say we would indeed have to take very seriously indeed. It's about all we've said. We've tried quite hard not to try to build a crisis atmosphere. We've tried to remain quite patient and calm in our public statements, and I think the North Koreans are puzzled because they had an image of President Bush as a crazy cowboy gunslinger, and I think they can't quite figure out what's going on. How come this guy who invaded Iraq, in their eyes, is saying very calm and rational things, and moreover giving assurances about a better future if we go along? So I think the North Koreans are trying to figure us out a bit. Right now, they again are holding out, saying that they see no particular utility to the six-party talks. Our guess is, though, that we probably will have another round. The North Koreans can only see such talks as being in their interests. We know that the Russians and the Chinese are both using their considerable influence to bring the North Koreans back to the table. And I think all of us can see somewhere out there a possible solution in the future. And the possible solution this time, put very simply, is one in which the North Koreans this time declare whatever their nuclear capabilities, whatever their programs, whatever their infrastructure is, open up the land so that it can be verified, that is, that which they declared can be verified by qualified, accredited inspectors, so that that capability, we can be certain, will never be restored. So our mantra is we seek the complete, verifiable, and irreversible dismantlement of the entire North Korean nuclear structure. We don't think that should be too hard for them in the end. The bargain is there if they want to take it. I think they know by now that if they do that, if they do it in a credible and verifiable way, the rest of us, the US, Japan, South Korea in particular, will make available to North Korea the kinds of economic assistance it needs. There is not going to be any threat or prospect of war. There will be no incentive to toy with the idea of regime change in North Korea, so they can relax on that score. And indeed, I think we would see, were all of this to come to pass, evolutionary forces beginning to take hold in that country, much as they took hold in China. For now, that may just be a dream, but I think in a nutshell, that is where we think we're going at this point. Okay, more than enough.
Well, we thank you very much for an extraordinarily dense and informative presentation. The Assistant Secretary will now answer questions, and he'll call upon the audience.
With the axis of evil speech and our invasion of Iraq, why should they not think of the president as a gunslinger? Second question, yesterday the president talked about going into an informal agreement with the North Koreans. What's the difference between the informal agreement and a formal agreement?
The quick answer to the first, which was debated frequently, is that, what can I say? I mean, it's the quick answer to it is foreign policy cannot be done by a cookie-cutter approach. So Iraq isn't North Korea. The concerns we had in Iraq, the capabilities we had in the region, the threat that we saw coming from Iraq were in each respect quite different than what we see in the case of North Korea. Again, not to put too fine a point on it, North Korea, I haven't even got into this, but in addition to the nuclear weapons capability, North Korea spends something like 35% of its GDP on its conventional military forces. The conventional military forces are arrayed just north of the demilitarized zone. If a war were to break out, including some kind of a preemptive strike, I don't think anyone in the U.S. who is rational doubts what is likely to occur. The North Koreans would very probably go for broke. They would launch their conventional artillery at Seoul, and it could indeed be turned into a sea of fire. The prospect of incinerating 10 to 100,000 of our allies is not one that particularly appeals to us as a policy option. So contrary to our image, we are somewhat sober in looking at questions of war and peace. I think the real answer is that. There are other questions as well that could be gone into there. In the question of Northeast Asia, we also have, underneath the rest, a question of alliance management, as we call it. We need to have a consensus with South Korea and with Japan on any policy approach we adopt towards North Korea. For us, it's vital because we have vibrant and enduring treaties of mutual defense and security with those two countries. We are trying to sort out differences of perspective, differences of approach, particularly with the South Koreans at this point. So that too is a part of the picture that is, I must say, a bit different than we had in Iraq. On the other question, what was the president talking about? Yeah, that was my wake-up call yesterday, Sunday, from a journalist who was a friend, but she phoned to ask what the president meant, and I said I really wasn't prepared to commit career suicide by commenting on the president at 5 a.m. on Sunday morning before I knew what he'd said, but now I do know what he said. And I think what his suggestion is simply this: we will not go the route of a bilateral non-aggression treaty. We've never done that in our history. We're not going to do it now. It's a silly device in any event. What we are prepared to contemplate, though, is not informal assurances. What we're prepared to contemplate are multilateral security assurances of some sort. We have not yet begun to explore with our allies what shape that might take. We can imagine many. Again, the theme of the day, I guess, the UN. We've looked at the UN Charter. There's language in the UN Charter that would apply to security assurances. There's language in the Non-Proliferation Treaty, which something like 190 nations have adhered to, that would bear on the question of treaty assurances. There are various agreements that were struck after the breakup of the Soviet Union that might bear on this. We've looked at the possibility that nuclear states, in this case China, Russia, the US, might afford some kind of guarantee to the non-nuclear states. We've looked at the possibility that 4 countries, those 3 plus Japan, could give some kind of security undertakings to both North and South Korea on condition that the Korean Peninsula not go nuclear. That's what the president had in mind, but it's at a very preliminary, stage.
Thank you.
Are you, or is anybody else in the State Department considering assisting in promoting the reunification of the country? As we all know, Nobel Peace Prize winners in Seoul have been urging that. It seems like the South Korean population would be agreeable to merging the two countries again. Wouldn't that change the dynamics of everything you've been talking about? Wouldn't that make the North become more South-like? And wouldn't that, in effect, remove the nuclear threat?
I mean, the answer is that really since Kim Dae-jung's administration in South Korea, yeah, the ROK government pursued a sunshine policy. The current government, the successor to Kim Dae-jung's government in South Korea, has not used that term, but has, I think, held high that same ideal of seeking some kind of an accommodation with North Korea. So as all of these other things I've talked about are going on, North and South Korea are also continuing to hold talks at many levels. They continue to hold ministerial level talks, and indeed just had a set of ministerial level talks over the last couple of days. Fact of the matter is, though, that the sunshine policy, I think anybody would say, was not a success. If you've followed this closely, you'll know that a particular businessman in South Korea took his life because it had become plain that the North Koreans were in fact bribed to come to the table the first time. So the much vaunted initial visit of Kim Dae-jung to North Korea was basically purchased at a very high price. North Korea has, I think, honed to a fine sheen this particular approach to diplomacy: pay us enough and we may be there. Pay us even more, we'll come smiling. This has come as a bit of a shock and a disillusionment. That had been kept as a secret from the South Korean populace. When it became plain what brought the North Koreans to the table was not kinship, a desire for reunification, love of their fellow countrymen to the South, but a desire to pocket whatever it was, $6 to $10 million, if I remember correctly. The South Koreans, I think, have begun to take stock. The current administration in the South has taken, I would say, a much tougher line in its internal discussions with the North. Another point to make is that the South Koreans had never actually accepted that North Korea had a nuclear capability or was working on it. Unfortunately, they now agree that North Korea does have that capability and probably has the weapons. That too has come as a bit of a disillusionment to them. So that's from the south side. On the north side, I don't know that anybody ever saw, other than as a faraway dream, the prospect of reunification. Our policy is indeed to support reunification. We would like at some point to see that for the reason you stated. We think that reunification inevitably would be a reunification with the dominant part of that reunified country being the vibrant, economically powerful South, no question. 48 million people, give or take, in the South, 22 or 23 million in the North. South Korea has emerged as a major export power. It's currently our fourth largest, the U.S.'s fourth largest trading partner after China. No question that if this were possible, we would very much want to support that in our policy, so we don't in any way attempt to impede, and indeed we support the North-South talks. Yeah.
Could you expand on People's Republic of China's role in getting the negotiations between North Korea and the U.S. going? It was said that they moved from being reluctant, even obstructionist, to being helpful in this. And please include in your answer the role of people of this Republic of China going from the state it was in the 1970s to what it is now, being a possible future to North Korea as opposed to Erich Honecker's East Germany or Ceausescu's Romania.
Okay, sort of a two-part question there. The first part has to do with the evolution in Chinese official attitudes and China's decision to position itself as one attempting to, if I understood you correctly, attempting to find a solution. What's that about? And with regard to North Korea, insofar as it seems on the surface to be so much like Ceausescu's Romania, can one not anticipate that its collapse might come a bit like Ceausescu's Romania? Is that the idea? I missed a few words there.
China's role as a model to North Korea,
okay, got
as
it.
opposed
yeah.
to
I'm sorry.
East Germany.
Yeah,
or
got it.
Romania.
Okay, China's role as a model to North Korea. Let me just give you a quick personal anecdote. I served, as was said, 3 times in Beijing. My second tour in Beijing was in 1982, 83, just as China was beginning to emerge truly from the Cultural Revolution. I think at that time, the very first modern hotel had been built in Beijing, which was basically the Holiday Inn Palo Alto transported to China. That was then the height of modernity. Okay, China was still a very poor and backward country in 1982, including in the big cities. One day over dinner with a bunch of Chinese, including from the People's Liberation Army, I think after a lot of toasts, frankly, one of the Chinese generals looked at me and said, "I can share a secret with you. We just had 6 North Korean generals defect to China." And he paused and said, "Can you imagine defecting to China? What must that country be like?" Okay. Okay, that's 1982, and I liked it when I heard it. Had a lot of resonance, and this guy was very intelligent, whether lubricated by Maltai or not. China just grew by leaps and bounds, as you know, over the 1980s, and as early as 1989, 90, 91, they had begun, while Deng Xiaoping was alive, attempting to persuade North Korea the only way out is to follow an economic model something like China's. Granted, North Korea is not China. It doesn't have the assets. It doesn't have the geography, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But the Chinese have sought really for almost 15 years now to persuade the North Koreans to take a hard look at the Chinese model of economic development, to emulate what it could, attract foreign investment, give tax incentives for foreign firms to come in there, give them 10 years or 20 years to make their profits, do anything to get in that foreign expertise and the foreign interest. When Kim Jong-il visited China, even before he succeeded his father, the Chinese made a point of taking him to their high-tech special economic zones, attempting to show them what North Korea could and should do. That kind of thing has intensified. The last time Kim Jong-il went, they deliberately took him to really the flashiest, most glittering parts of China, again, to really I think, etch in his mind the continuum from when he first went to China, and it was not unlike North Korea, and what it is today, not unlike Tokyo or New York City and all the rest. So yeah, China stands there, I think, as certainly an encouragement to North Korea to contemplate one possible better future in doing that. The North Koreans, for whatever reason, well, I mean, I frankly think they believe it's too tough. They think, as we do, that if they open up even a little bit, they're going to set in motion evolutionary forces that will ultimately topple their regime. So what they attempted to do was half measures, actually. Kim Jong-il gave the word to set up a special economic zone on the border with China, the Sinuiju. Crazy. I mean, it has no particular market. Why would you set up an economic zone on the border with China, particularly when the Chinese didn't want it? As an apparently calculated insult to China, the North Koreans chose to be governor of their new special economic zone on the border, a man named Yang Bin, who was arrested a week later for flagrant corruption in China. So the Chinese have been asking themselves, what message are we to take from this? Meanwhile, China's relations with South Korea are just booming. I had lunch with the South Korean ambassador in Beijing a few months ago. He was telling me that now there are 45,000 ROK citizens living and working full-time in Beijing. There's something like 8,000 South Korean business firms set up in Shandong province alone, Shandong being the province directly across from South Korea. So the South Korean economic presence, the economic might in China and vice versa is unmistakable. These two are really forging a formidable alliance that was originally based on the economy, but has now become a political alliance as well. Once again, I mean, if I were in North Korea witnessing that, I would be rocked at the sight of it all. China, which once was supposedly, quote, closer than lips and teeth, now is just gnashing its teeth at the North Koreans. So anyway, China, we think, is going to continue to play that role as model, as encourager, and in the end, in some ways, enforcer as well. So hopefully we're not wildly optimistic.
A representative product of Chicago, of Baltimore's public schools, the ambassador has given us, I think, what is an extraordinary presentation, filled with information, unusually direct, unusually enjoyable.
Yeah, I'm retiring tomorrow, so I thought I could. Yeah.
Thank you so much. We're grateful.
Thank you very much.